Thank you, Noriko, and thank you for giving me the occasion to address the meeting. So maybe first one word about Climate Action Network Europe. We are the umbrella organization of NGOs working on climate and energy policy development in Europe with over 130 members in more than 30 European countries, so a bit broader than just the European Union. I will very briefly address three issues. One, do we need to strengthen the EU target? Secondly, is it realistic? And thirdly, what is the potential? But very briefly. So, is it needed? Well, we've all already noticed that in Paris, all the governments of the world recognized that there is a need to keep temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius, that otherwise a number of countries in the world will be in dire risk, a number of communities in the world will be in dire risk, and the impacts for everybody will be extremely high. So the 1.5 degrees is really the benchmark that came out of Paris. So if we now compare that to the benchmark we have in Europe, which is an 80% emission reduction target for 2050, the EU refers to 80 to 95%, but the roadmap that they made is actually an 80% emission reduction, which is the basis for setting the targets for 2030 and 2040. Now that 80% comes from an IPCC report, or the IPCC report, the fourth assessment report in 2007, that said that in order to keep temperature rise between 2 to 2.4 degrees Celsius, industrialized countries would need to reduce their emissions by 80 to 95%. There is no way that 80% can ensure us either to stay well below 2 degrees, let alone to stay below 1.5. Anybody saying that is completely outside of reality. So it's clear that the EU needs to start revising its long-term target now. And that is actually not just NGOs who say that. We have established a coalition for higher ambition, which both in March as yesterday sent out a letter to European heads of state and government saying exactly that, saying that if the EU wants to be credible, if it really wants to make its policies to be coherent with what it had agreed in Paris, then now is the time to review the targets. So that is very clear. There is a clear need to review those targets. Secondly, and can somebody push the button? Secondly, is it possible? Which button? This one? Yeah. This is a very, very simple graph. The graph shows the line in blue is the actual emission reductions in Europe since the start of the Kyoto Protocol in 2008. So between 2008 and 2014, EU emissions on average were reduced by almost 2% per year, 1.95 to be correct, almost 2%. What the EU is proposing from 2014 to 2030 is an emission reduction of just a bit more than 1% a year. One would assume that with the Paris Agreement, there would be more action. What we see in Europe is that the European Union is intending to halve the level of action that they've taken in the past towards the future. If we would continue with the same average as we had in the last 6 years, we would end up, that's the red line, we would end up at a reduction of 55% in 2030 and a reduction of 95% in 2050. So that's the more realistic part. Now, one of the strange things, if you look at the green line from 2014 to 2030 goes down with 1%. That's actually what the member states have told the Commission that they will do in the next 6 years. So they've reduced their emissions by 12% in the previous 6 years, but in the next 6 years they will do it by 1%. If an NGO would say something like that, they would say we live in La La Land, but the member states can do that. I mean, of course, this is completely nonsense. The EU emissions will further reduce way below minus 24% by 2020. And so keeping on that 40% pathway is really something that we cannot accept, that businesses cannot accept, that trade unions cannot accept, and that local authorities cannot accept. So that's on the realistic part. And then just to go further on the potential part, there's been plenty of studies the last couple of years about what the potential is. There's the Fraunhofer study for the German government that has indicated there's a potential to reduce energy consumption by up to 50% by 2030. So there's an enormous potential there that needs to be reaped. Of course, for that, action needs to be taken now. And in order to achieve that kind of emission reductions, we need the right incentives for industries, for households, for local authorities, and so on to do so. Similarly, there's research being done, amongst others, by the German Aerospace Institute for Greenpeace that shows that we can achieve almost 100% renewables by 2050 in Europe. And so that we can achieve more than 45% renewables in the final energy consumption by 2030. And there's other research, I mean, there's also research being done for other NGOs and so on, but I'm not just referring to Greenpeace. And there's research being done by the Eco Institute showing that there is a clear potential not only in the energy sector, but also in the other sectors, agriculture, forestry, waste, and so on, to, together with the reductions possible in the energy sector, to reduce our total emissions by more than 55% in the EU by 2030. So all of these are clear scenarios, models, and so on that show there is a potential as long as there's a clear investment framework, as long as there's a clear target, as long as there's regulation, and as long as there is clear, as it's been said before, a clear financial framework that ensures investments in the right kind of innovations, that ensure investments in low carbon development, etc., etc. And part of that financial framework will need to ensure that we get rid of fossil fuel subsidies. It's unbelievable how many fossil fuel subsidies are still happening or still being given to industries in the European Union at this moment. It's over several hundreds of billions of euro that are still being given to industries every year, and that needs to end. I thank you.